Imagine losing everything you own in a single moment. Your wealth, your possessions, your carefully constructed life, all swallowed by the sea in an instant. For most people, this would be the end of their story. But for one man shipwrecked on the shores of ancient Athens around 300 BCE, it became the beginning of something extraordinary. From the wreckage of his merchant ship emerged a philosophy that would reshape how humanity understands virtue, fate, and the art of living well. This is the story of Zeno of Citium, the man who turned personal catastrophe into one of history's most enduring schools of thought, Stoicism. A philosophy born from loss that teaches us how to find unshakable peace in an uncertain world. The Mediterranean Sea can be treacherous. One moment the waters shine like polished bronze under the sun. The next they rise in mountainous waves that swallow ships whole. Zeno of Citium knew these waters well. He was a merchant, born around 334 BCE in the Phoenician city of Citium, on the island of Cyprus. His life followed the predictable path of a successful trader, voyaging between ports, buying and selling the precious purple dye that made his family wealthy. Purple dye extracted from murex snails was among the most valuable commodities in the ancient world, worth more than its weight in silver. Zeno's ships carried this liquid treasure across the Mediterranean, and he had every reason to expect a prosperous future managing the family business. But fate had different plans. During one of his voyages, somewhere between Cyprus and the Greek mainland, disaster struck. The exact details are lost to history, but the result was catastrophic. Zeno's ship went down, taking with it not just the cargo but his entire fortune. Everything he had worked for, everything he had inherited, everything that defined his identity as a successful merchant vanished beneath the waves. He survived, washing up on the shores near Athens with nothing but his life. Most people in Zeno's position would have been destroyed by such a loss. The ancient world offered little safety net for those who fell from prosperity into poverty. But something remarkable happened in Zeno's mind during those desperate hours. Rather than falling into despair, he began to ask himself a question that would echo through the centuries. If external things like wealth and possessions could be taken away so easily, were they ever really valuable in the first place? If a single storm could reduce a prosperous merchant to a penniless refugee, what did that say about the nature of fortune and the proper foundation for human happiness? These were not idle philosophical musings. They were urgent existential questions forced upon him by circumstance. And Athens, where he now found himself stranded, was the perfect place to seek answers. This was the golden age of Greek philosophy. The great Plato had died just a few decades earlier, but his academy still flourished. Aristotle had recently established his own school, the Lyceum. The streets and marketplaces buzzed with philosophical debate. Everywhere Zeno turned, he encountered people engaged in the passionate pursuit of wisdom. According to ancient sources, Zeno wandered into a bookshop shortly after his arrival in Athens. The bookseller was reading aloud from Xenophon's Memorabilia, a collection of conversations with Socrates. Something in those words struck Zeno with the force of revelation. Here was Socrates, a man who owned almost nothing, who walked barefoot through Athens, who possessed no wealth or status, yet who seemed to have discovered a happiness and inner freedom that no shipwreck could destroy. Zeno turned to the bookseller and asked a question that would determine the rest of his life. Where can I find men like this? The bookseller pointed him toward Crates of Thebes, one of the most prominent philosophers then teaching in Athens. Crates belonged to the Cynic school, founded by Diogenes of Sinope, famous for living in a barrel and carrying a lamp through the streets in daylight, claiming to be searching for an honest man. The Cynics taught that happiness came from living in accordance with nature, rejecting social conventions, and training oneself to need as little as possible. They were the radical minimalists of the ancient world, deliberately embracing poverty and discomfort as a path to freedom. For the next decade or more, Zeno studied with Crates and other Cynic philosophers. He learned to view his shipwreck not as a catastrophe, but as a liberation. His wealth had been a chain, binding him to conventional notions of success and happiness. Losing it freed him to discover what truly mattered. The Cynics taught him that virtue was the only real good, that external circumstances could not touch the soul of a wise person, and that true freedom came from wanting nothing that fortune could take away. But Zeno was not entirely satisfied with Cynic philosophy. He found their extreme rejection of social norms excessive and counterproductive. The Cynics deliberately shocked people with outrageous behavior, believing this would shake others out of their conventional delusions. Diogenes had supposedly urinated in public, masturbated in the marketplace, and told Alexander the Great to get out of his sunlight. Zeno respected the Cynics' commitment to virtue and their indifference to external goods, but he believed philosophy should make people better citizens and community members, not deliberate outcasts. So Zeno studied with other philosophers as well. He spent time with Stilpo of Megara, learning logic and dialectic. He explored the teachings of Polemon at Plato's Academy, absorbing ideas about virtue and the good life. He studied the natural philosophy of Heraclitus, who taught that the universe was governed by a divine rational principle he called logos, and that everything flowed and changed according to this cosmic reason. From these various schools, Zeno began synthesizing something new, taking what he found valuable from each tradition, while correcting what he saw as their errors and excesses. Around 300 BCE, after years of study and reflection, Zeno began teaching his own philosophy. He could not afford to rent a proper school building, so he taught in a public colonnade called the Stoa Poikile, the painted porch, decorated with famous murals depicting Athenian military victories. His students and followers came to be known as Stoics, after the Stoa where they gathered. What began as makeshift accommodation for a poor philosopher became the name of one of history's most influential philosophical movements. Zeno's personal example became as important as his teachings. Here was a man who had lost everything material, but gained something far more valuable, unshakable tranquility and moral purpose. He lived simply, eating mainly figs and bread, drinking simple wine, and needing little beyond what sustained life. Yet he was not a cynic radical, deliberately flouting social norms. He participated in Athenian civic life, maintained friendships, and presented himself as a respectable member of society. He showed that one could be indifferent to external goods while still functioning effectively in the world. Ancient sources describe Zeno as an intense and serious man, thin from his austere lifestyle, dark-complexioned from his Phoenician heritage, and so absent-minded in his philosophical contemplation that he sometimes appeared ridiculous to casual observers. But those who studied with him recognized profound wisdom. He taught not through eloquent speeches, but through careful, logical argument and personal example. He was known for his integrity, his self-discipline, and his unwavering commitment to living according to his principles. Zeno taught in Athens for over 40 years, developing a comprehensive philosophical system that addressed logic, physics, and ethics. He attracted students from across the Greek world, many of them from wealthy and prominent families who were drawn to this philosophy that promised immunity from fortune's reversals. His school produced several important philosophers who would develop and refine Stoic doctrine, including Cleanthes, his successor as head of the school, and Chrysippus, who would become the most prolific and systematic Stoic theorist. Zeno died around 262 BCE, at approximately 72 years old. According to legend, he tripped while leaving the Stoa and broke a finger. Taking this as a sign from fate, he struck the ground and quoted a line from the tragic poet, "I come, why call me so?" and held his breath until he died. Whether or not this dramatic story is true, it reflects how later generations viewed Zeno as a man who lived and died in perfect accordance with his philosophy, accepting whatever fate brought with complete equanimity. The shipwreck that seemed to destroy Zeno's life actually created it. In losing everything external, he discovered what could never be lost, the capacity to choose virtue regardless of circumstances. This insight, born from personal catastrophe, became the foundation of a philosophy that would console emperors and slaves, warriors and contemplatives, ancient Romans and modern readers, offering everyone who encounters it a path to inner freedom that no storm can disturb. Zeno built Stoicism as an integrated system, a complete worldview that addressed every aspect of human existence. Ancient philosophers did not separate disciplines the way modern academics do. A true philosopher needed to understand logic, physics, and ethics as interconnected parts of one coherent understanding of reality. Zeno compared philosophy to a fruitful field, where logic was the protective fence, physics was the soil and trees, and ethics was the fruit. Or alternatively, he likened philosophy to an egg, with logic as the shell, physics as the white, and ethics as the yolk at the center. These metaphors emphasize that you cannot properly understand ethics without first understanding the physical nature of the universe and the logical tools needed to think correctly about both. The Stoic system begins with logic, though this is often the least familiar part of Stoicism to modern readers who encounter it through popular writings that focus on practical ethics. But Zeno insisted that correct thinking must precede correct living. Logic for the Stoics encompassed not just formal reasoning, but also epistemology, the theory of knowledge, and rhetoric, the art of effective communication. How do we know what we claim to know? What distinguishes truth from falsehood? How can we protect ourselves from being deceived by false impressions? Zeno taught that knowledge begins with sense impressions. When we perceive something, it creates an impression in our consciousness. The Greek word is phantasia, which we might translate as appearance or presentation. Reality presents itself to us through these impressions. But not all impressions are reliable. Sometimes we misperceive things. Sometimes our senses are impaired. Sometimes we jump to conclusions based on incomplete information. So, we need a method for distinguishing trustworthy impressions from unreliable ones. Zeno introduced the concept of the cataleptic impression, from the Greek word meaning to grasp firmly. A cataleptic impression is one that is so clear, distinct, and coherent that it compels assent. It comes from something real. It represents that reality accurately, and it has a quality that distinguishes it from false impressions. When you have a cataleptic impression, you can be certain of its truth. The wise person, according to Zeno, gives assent only to cataleptic impressions and withholds judgment about everything else. This prevents error and maintains the clarity of mind necessary for living well. This epistemology had immediate ethical implications. Most human suffering comes from false judgments about reality. We believe that wealth is good in itself, so we suffer when we lose it. We believe that death is evil in itself, so we live in fear of it. We believe that other people's opinions determine our worth, so we become slaves to reputation. But what if these beliefs are based on unreliable impressions? What if we have assented to appearances that do not accurately represent reality? Correcting our impressions and judgments becomes the first step toward freedom and happiness. The second major division of Stoic philosophy is physics, their understanding of the natural world. This might seem like a strange concern for a philosophy focused on ethics and the good life. But Zeno insisted that ethics must be grounded in an accurate understanding of reality. How can we live in accordance with nature if we do not understand what nature is? How can we accept fate if we do not understand what fate means? How can we fulfill our role in the cosmic order if we do not comprehend that order? Zeno taught that the universe is a living, rational, divine being. Drawing on earlier Greek philosophy, particularly Heraclitus, he identified the cosmos with God, with reason, with Providence, with Zeus, and with nature. These are not separate entities, but different names for the same divine rational principle that organizes and animates all of reality. The Stoics were pantheists, believing that God is not separate from the universe, but is the universe's ordering intelligence. This divine reason, which the Stoics called logos, pervades everything. It manifests in the regular patterns we observe in nature, the orbits of celestial bodies, the changing of seasons, the growth of plants and animals, and the structure of human reason itself. The same rational principle that governs the cosmos also exists within each human being as our capacity for reason. When we think logically and make sound judgments, we are participating in the divine reason that structures all reality. For Zeno, this meant that the universe is fundamentally rational and purposeful. Nothing happens randomly or chaotically. Everything that occurs is the necessary result of prior causes, all of which ultimately trace back to the organizing principle of divine reason. The universe is like a perfect machine, or better, like a living organism, where every part serves the function of the whole. This is what the Stoics meant by fate or providence. Not some external force imposing events on an otherwise chaotic world, but the internal rational principle through which the universe organizes itself according to perfect necessity. This Stoic physics had profound implications for how human beings should understand themselves and their place in the cosmos. We are not alien to nature or separate from it. We are parts of the cosmic whole, organs of the universal organism. Our reason is a fragment of divine reason. Our individual lives are chapters in the cosmic story. This means that what happens to us is not random or meaningless, but part of a rational order that we may not fully comprehend, but can trust to be ultimately purposeful. The Stoics illustrated this with the image of a dog tied to a cart. The cart is moving in a certain direction determined by the driver. The dog has a choice. It can resist and be dragged along painfully, or it can willingly run alongside the cart and make the journey comfortable. Either way, the cart goes where it is going. Similarly, fate will unfold as it must. We can resist and suffer, or we can willingly align ourselves with necessity and flow with it rather than against it. This is what amor fati, love of fate, means in its original Stoic context, not passive resignation but active acceptance and even celebration of what must be. But the Stoics were not fatalists in the sense of believing that human choice and effort are meaningless. They made a crucial distinction between what is up to us and what is not up to us. External events, what happens in the world, are determined by the causal chain of fate and are therefore not ultimately up to us. But our judgments, our assent to impressions, our choices about how to respond, these are up to us. This internal freedom of judgment is the one thing that fate cannot touch. Even if you chain a Stoic sage in prison, you cannot force them to judge that imprisonment is bad or that they should despair. Their inner freedom remains absolute. This brings us to the heart of Stoicism, ethics, the study of how to live well. Zeno defined the goal of life as living in agreement with nature. This deceptively simple formula contains the entire Stoic ethical program. To live in agreement with nature means several things simultaneously. It means living according to your own nature as a rational being, using reason to guide your choices. It means living according to the nature of the universe, accepting your role in the cosmic whole. And it means living according to the nature of specific situations, responding appropriately to whatever circumstances arise. The foundation of Stoic ethics is the distinction between things that are good, bad, and indifferent. Zeno taught that virtue is the only true good, and vice is the only true evil. Everything else, wealth, poverty, health, sickness, life, death, reputation, obscurity, pleasure, pain, all of these are neither good nor bad in themselves. They are indifferent with respect to happiness. This was Zeno's most radical claim, and the one that most sharply distinguished Stoicism from common opinion. How can health be indifferent? How can wealth be neither good nor bad? Zeno's argument was subtle and powerful. These things are indifferent because they do not by themselves make us virtuous or vicious, happy or unhappy. A wealthy person can be vicious, a poor person can be virtuous, a healthy person can be miserable, a sick person can be serene. Virtue is what makes life good, and virtue is entirely within our power regardless of external circumstances. Therefore, external circumstances are indifferent to the one thing that truly matters. But Zeno was not claiming that there is no difference between wealth and poverty or health and sickness. He introduced the distinction between preferred and dispreferred indifference. Some indifferent things, while not good in themselves, are naturally preferred and accord with nature. Health, wealth, good reputation, these are preferred indifference. Others are naturally dispreferred. Sickness, poverty, bad reputation, these work against our natural functioning. A rational person will generally prefer health to sickness, all else being equal. But what makes them rational and virtuous is that they do not mistake these preferred indifference for genuine goods. They do not stake their happiness on obtaining them or become devastated by losing them. Virtue itself consists in living rationally, which for Zeno meant living with wisdom, courage, justice, and moderation. These are the four cardinal virtues, and the Stoics taught that they are all aspects of a single, unified excellence of character. The wise person understands reality correctly. The courageous person fears nothing except vice itself. The just person gives everyone their due. The moderate person has their desires properly ordered. These virtues are not separate qualities but different expressions of the same rational excellence. Zeno believed that virtue is all or nothing. You cannot be partly virtuous any more than you can be partly pregnant. Either you have achieved the wisdom and excellence of the sage, or you have not. Most people, even those making progress toward wisdom, are still fools. This sounds harsh, but the Stoics meant it technically rather than as an insult. A fool is someone whose judgments are still corrupted by false beliefs about good and evil. They still think external things are good or bad in themselves. They still experience irrational emotions based on these false judgments. Until these errors are completely corrected, a person remains a fool, even if they are progressing toward wisdom. The sage, by contrast, is perfectly rational. They never assent to false impressions. They never make incorrect judgments about what is good or bad. They experience only appropriate feelings that accord with correct understanding. They possess complete tranquility because nothing external can disturb them. They are perfectly free because they desire only what is within their power. They are perfectly happy because they have everything they need, virtue itself. Zeno knew that such perfect wisdom was extraordinarily rare. He may have doubted whether anyone actually achieved it. But the sage served as an ideal, a North Star by which students could orient their progress. Even if we never become perfectly wise, we can make progress toward wisdom. We can identify and correct false judgments. We can practice aligning our will with nature. We can strengthen our reason and weaken our passions. This process of moral and intellectual development is what Stoics called making progress, and it is available to everyone, regardless of circumstances. The Stoic system Zeno created was not merely theoretical, it was designed as a practical guide for living well. Every aspect of the philosophy had immediate application. Study logic to think clearly and avoid being deceived. Study physics to understand your place in the cosmic whole and accept what must be. Study ethics to distinguish what matters from what does not, and align your will with reason. This integrated approach made Stoicism a complete philosophy of life, one that could sustain people through shipwrecks, literal and metaphorical. Zeno understood that philosophy is not merely about holding correct theoretical opinions, but about transforming how you actually live. The Stoic sage is not defined by believing certain propositions about virtue, but by actually being virtuous in practice. This emphasis on lived philosophy, rather than abstract speculation, became one of Stoicism's most distinctive and appealing features. Zeno created not just a philosophical system, but a way of life, a set of practices and attitudes that students could adopt to make real progress toward wisdom. The foundation of Stoic practice is the discipline of assent. Every moment, impressions arise in consciousness. You see something, hear something, remember something, imagine something. Each impression carries an implicit claim about reality. This is good, that is bad, this threatens you, that will help you. The untrained mind automatically assents to these impressions, accepting their claims without examination. This automatic assent is the source of all irrational emotions and destructive behaviors. Zeno taught his students to interrupt this automatic process. When an impression arises, pause before giving assent. Examine it carefully. Is this catalectic, clear and certain, or is it confused and unreliable? Does it represent reality accurately, or does it contain false judgments? This might seem like it would make life impossibly slow and deliberate, but with practice it becomes natural. You develop the ability to assess impressions rapidly and accurately, giving assent only to what is genuinely true and withholding judgment about everything else. Consider a practical example. Your business partner betrays you, costing you a significant sum of money. The immediate impression might be, "This is terrible, I am ruined, I should be devastated." The untrained mind assents to this impression automatically and experiences intense suffering. But the Stoic pauses. Is this impression accurate? Is money a true good that I have lost? Or is it an indifferent that I happen to prefer but whose loss cannot truly harm me? Is my business partner's action within my control? No. Is my response to it within my control? Yes. What does virtue require in this situation? Perhaps justice in pursuing appropriate remedies, perhaps forgiveness if that serves a higher purpose, certainly tranquility in recognizing that nothing truly bad has happened to me, because I have not become less virtuous. This discipline of assent requires constant vigilance. Zeno compared it to a sentry posted at the gates of the mind, carefully examining every impression before allowing it to enter and influence judgment. The sentry asks, "Do you represent reality accurately? Do you mistake indifference for goods? Do you counsel me toward virtue or vice?" Only impressions that pass this examination are admitted. This practice gradually transforms the entire structure of your emotional life. The Stoics recognize that most of what we call emotions are actually judgments. When you feel angry, you are really judging that someone has wronged you, and that this wrong is a bad thing that deserves punishment. When you feel afraid, you are judging that something bad is about to happen and that you should avoid it. When you feel sad, you are judging that something bad has happened and that you have lost something good. But if these judgments are based on false opinions about what is truly good and bad, then the emotions that arise from them are irrational and should be eliminated. Zeno distinguished between emotions, which are irrational movements of the soul based on false judgments, and appropriate feelings, which are rational responses to reality. The sage does not experience anger, fear, grief, or excessive joy, because these emotions all involve false beliefs about externals being truly good or bad. But the sage does experience appropriate caution about maintaining virtue, appropriate joy in virtuous action, and appropriate wish for others to achieve virtue. These are rational feelings, consistent with correct understanding. For most people still making progress toward wisdom, the goal is not to immediately eliminate all emotions, but to gradually reduce their intensity and frequency by correcting the false judgments that cause them. Every time you catch yourself experiencing an irrational emotion, you have identified a false belief that needs correction. Anxiety reveals that you believe something external threatens your true good. Anger reveals that you believe someone has harmed you in a way that matters. Grief reveals that you believe you have lost something genuinely good. Each emotion is an opportunity for philosophical work. Another crucial Stoic practice is voluntary discomfort. Zeno lived simply not because he was too poor to afford luxuries, though he did have limited means, but because he deliberately trained himself to need little. He wanted to be free from dependence on external goods. If you need expensive food, comfortable housing, and luxurious possessions to be content, then you are vulnerable to fortune. If you can be content with simple food, basic shelter, and few possessions, then fortune has little power over you. The Stoics advocated periodic practice of poverty. Spend time with minimal resources. Eat simple food. Sleep on a hard surface. Expose yourself to cold or heat without complaint. This is not asceticism for its own sake or belief that suffering is virtuous. It is training. Athletes do not lift weights because lifting weights is valuable in itself, but because it strengthens them for their actual competition. Similarly, Stoics voluntarily embrace discomfort to strengthen their capacity to remain tranquil when involuntary discomfort arrives. Zeno also emphasized the importance of contemplating mortality. The sage is not troubled by death because they understand that death is an indifferent, not an evil. But reaching this understanding requires practice. Zeno taught his students to regularly meditate on death, to imagine their own final moments, to reflect on the deaths of others, to recognize the impermanence of everything. This is not morbid pessimism but realistic preparation. Death will come for everyone. Those who have contemplated it deeply will meet it with equanimity. Those who have refused to think about it will be devastated when it arrives. The Stoics used a practice called premeditatio malorum, the premeditation of evils. Each morning, imagine everything that could go wrong today. Your business could fail. Your loved one could die. You could be insulted or injured. You could lose your possessions or your reputation. Vividly picture these scenarios. Then remind yourself that none of these things would harm your true good, your virtue. They are all indifferents. If they happen, you will handle them with wisdom and courage. This practice serves multiple purposes. It reduces anxiety by making you realize you can cope with anything. It prevents being blindsided by misfortune, and it makes you grateful for everything that does not go wrong. Zeno taught that every situation presents an opportunity to practice virtue. You never face circumstances that do not call for wisdom, courage, justice, or moderation in some form. Wealth calls for moderation and justice in its use. Poverty calls for wisdom and courage in endurance. Conflict calls for courage and justice in standing up for what is right. Peace calls for moderation and wisdom in not becoming complacent. Every moment of life is an opportunity for moral training. This means that difficult circumstances are not obstacles to virtue, but opportunities for it. The Stoics developed a remarkable perspective on adversity. Challenges are not evils to be avoided, but training equipment provided by fate. Zeno would say that just as a wrestler needs strong opponents to develop skill, a person needs difficult circumstances to develop virtue. Easy times make soft people. Hardship creates the possibility of greatness. When fortune brings you a challenge, thank it for the opportunity to prove your virtue. The Stoic also practices what would later be called negative visualization. Regularly imagine losing the things you currently have. Picture your home burning down, your business failing, your loved ones dying. This is not to torture yourself, but to prepare yourself and to appreciate what you have while you have it. The Stoics knew that attachment and taking things for granted are sources of suffering. When you lose what you assumed would always be there, you suffer terribly. But if you never forget that everything is temporary and could be lost at any moment, you appreciate it more deeply while you have it, and lose it more gracefully when it is taken away. Zeno emphasized that Stoic practice is not about withdrawing from life, but about engaging with it from a position of inner freedom. The sage participates fully in social life, has friendships and relationships, pursues appropriate indifference like health and wealth, and contributes to their community. But they do all of this without attachment, without confusing these activities with true good. They play their role in the cosmic drama fully, while remembering that they are acting a part, not staking their happiness on the outcome. This requires what the later Stoics would call the reserve clause. In all your pursuits, add the mental qualification, if fate permits or if nature allows. I will work hard to build a successful business if fate permits. I will strive to help my friend if nature allows. I will attempt to be healthy, with the reservation that this may not be granted. This clause preserves your equanimity when things do not go as planned. You did your part. You acted rationally and virtuously, that the outcome was not up to you. You can be satisfied with having done what was in your power, regardless of results. Zeno also taught the importance of philosophical community. While virtue is ultimately an individual achievement, the path to virtue is aided by studying with teachers and fellow students. Philosophical discussion helps clarify thinking, identify false beliefs, and provide examples of how to handle various situations. Zeno's students in the Stoa formed a community of mutual support and accountability, helping each other make progress toward wisdom. The Stoic practices Zeno established were designed to be accessible to anyone, regardless of circumstances. You do not need wealth or leisure or special resources to practice Stoicism. You need only your capacity for reason and choice. A slave in chains can practice the discipline of assent just as well as a free citizen, perhaps better because their circumstances make the distinction between what is and is not in their power more obvious. This democratic accessibility became one of Stoicism's great strengths and explains why it appealed to people from every social class. Zeno himself embodied these practices. Ancient sources describe him as living simply, speaking plainly, accepting whatever came without complaint, and maintaining perfect composure in all situations. He was once struck by someone in anger, but did not retaliate or even show irritation. When asked why he did not respond, he replied that it would be ridiculous to get angry at a donkey for kicking him. The person who struck him was acting from ignorance and passion, like an irrational animal. Why should a rational person be disturbed by the actions of someone who does not know better? This anecdote captures the essence of Stoic practice. Train yourself to view reality accurately, maintain control over your judgments and responses, and remain tranquil regardless of external circumstances. Make progress daily by identifying and correcting false beliefs, practicing virtue in whatever situations arise, and strengthening your capacity for rational choice. This is the art of living that Zeno discovered after his shipwreck and taught to generations of students who came to the painted porch, seeking wisdom. The Stoic formula for the good life, living in agreement with nature, requires understanding what Zeno meant by nature. This was not a simple concept, but a rich and multifaceted idea that connected Stoic ethics to their physics and their understanding of the human place in the cosmos. To live according to nature meant to live according to several distinct but related natures simultaneously, and grasping this complexity is essential for understanding Stoic ethics. First, living according to nature means living according to universal nature, the rational order of the cosmos itself. The universe, as Zeno taught, is organized by divine reason. Everything that happens is part of a rational pattern, even if we cannot always discern that pattern from our limited perspective. The cosmos is like a perfectly designed organism where every part serves the function of the whole. Living according to universal nature means accepting your role in this cosmic order, recognizing that you are part of something vastly greater than yourself, and aligning your will with the will of the whole. This acceptance is not passive resignation, but active cooperation. Imagine you are a musician in an orchestra. You have been assigned a particular part to play. You did not choose this part, and you might have preferred a different one. But if you want to contribute to the beautiful symphony the orchestra is creating, you need to play your assigned part well, rather than resenting it or trying to play someone else's part. Similarly, fate has assigned each person a role in the cosmic drama. You might not have chosen your circumstances, your talents, your limitations, or the events that happen to you. But you can choose to play your assigned role virtuously, contributing to the rational order of the whole. Zeno used another metaphor to explain this point. Life is like a play, and we are actors who have been assigned roles by the director. You might be cast as a king or a beggar, a hero or a villain, a character who enjoys a long life, or one who dies in the first act. The role itself is not up to you. What is up to you is how well you play it. A good actor gives their best performance regardless of the role. They do not complain about being cast as a beggar when they wanted to be a king. They find the truth and dignity in whatever character they have been assigned and bring it to life skillfully. This is what it means to live according to universal nature, accepting what fate brings and responding to it with excellence. Second, living according to nature means living according to human nature specifically. Zeno taught that every being has a nature, a characteristic way of functioning that defines what it is. The nature of a plant is to grow, absorb nutrients, and reproduce. The nature of an animal is to pursue what sustains it and avoid what harms it, guided by instinct and sensation. What then is the nature of a human being? What distinguishes us from plants and animals? The answer, according to Zeno, is reason. Human beings are rational animals. Our defining characteristic is our capacity for reason, for understanding general principles, for deliberating about how to act, for distinguishing true from false and good from bad. To live according to human nature therefore means to live rationally, to allow reason to govern our choices, rather than being driven by irrational impulses, false opinions, or unexamined habits. Just as a plant flourishes by growing according to its nature, and an animal flourishes by following its healthy instincts, a human being flourishes by developing and exercising their rational capacities. This does not mean suppressing or denying our animal nature. We are embodied beings with physical needs and natural impulses. We need food, shelter, and reproduction like any animal. Zeno did not advocate denying these natural inclinations. What he taught was that in human beings, these impulses should be guided by reason rather than followed blindly. We should eat, but rationally, choosing food that maintains health rather than indulging every craving. We should pursue wealth, but rationally, acquiring what serves legitimate needs rather than accumulating compulsively. We should have relationships, but rationally, forming connections based on virtue and mutual benefit rather than mere passion or need. The key is that reason transforms how we pursue natural objectives. Animals pursue pleasure and avoid pain instinctively without reflection. Humans can ask whether a particular pleasure is worth pursuing, or whether a particular pain is worth enduring. Animals flee from threats automatically. Humans can evaluate whether something really threatens what matters and choose courage over cowardice. This rational governance of natural impulses is what distinguishes human excellence from mere animal functioning. Third, living according to nature means living according to your own individual nature. While all humans share rational nature, each person has particular characteristics that define their individual nature. You have certain natural talents and limitations, certain roles in your family and community, certain circumstances that define your situation. Living according to your own nature means recognizing these particularities and acting appropriately within them. Zeno taught that virtue expresses itself differently in different circumstances. A parent's virtue involves caring for their children appropriately. A ruler's virtue involves governing justly. A soldier's virtue involves courage in battle. A merchant's virtue involves honesty in business dealings. Each role calls for virtue, but virtue manifests differently according to the specific requirements of each situation. This is why Stoicism never advocates a one-size-fits-all approach to ethics. What is appropriate for one person in one situation may not be appropriate for another person in different circumstances. This introduces the Stoic concept of appropriate actions or proper functions, kathakonta in Greek. These are actions that accord with nature in a given situation. It is appropriate for parents to care for their children, for citizens to obey just laws, for friends to help each other, for people to maintain their health. These appropriate actions are rational responses to natural relationships and circumstances. Performing them is not yet virtue, because you could do the right thing for the wrong reasons. But virtue always expresses itself through appropriate actions chosen for the right reasons. Zeno emphasized that understanding appropriate action requires wisdom and judgment. There are no simple rules that apply mechanically to every situation. Sometimes it is appropriate to preserve your life. Sometimes it is appropriate to sacrifice it. Sometimes it is appropriate to speak, sometimes to remain silent. Sometimes it is appropriate to seek wealth, sometimes to abandon it. The wise person discerns what each situation calls for and acts accordingly, guided by reason and virtue rather than by rigid rules or conventional expectations. This flexibility made Stoicism adaptable to any circumstances. There is no situation in which virtue is impossible, because every situation calls for some appropriate response. A wealthy person can be virtuous by using wealth wisely and generously. A poor person can be virtuous by maintaining dignity and not being corrupted by envy. A ruler can be virtuous by governing justly. A subject can be virtuous by being a good citizen. A healthy person can be virtuous by maintaining health and helping others. A sick person can be virtuous by enduring illness with courage. The form changes, but the underlying principle remains constant. Use reason to determine appropriate action and choose it for the right reasons. Fourth, living according to nature means living socially as part of a human community. Zeno taught that human beings are by nature social creatures. We are not self-sufficient individuals, but interdependent parts of various communities, families, cities, nations, and ultimately the cosmopolis, the universal community of rational beings. Living according to nature, therefore, means fulfilling our social roles and contributing to the common good. The Stoics developed a sophisticated social ethics based on this understanding. We have natural affections for our families, natural loyalty to our communities, and natural bonds of kinship with all rational beings. These social feelings are not irrational passions to be eliminated, but natural impulses to be guided by reason. The wise person loves their family, but this love is rational rather than possessive. They serve their community, but this service is motivated by justice rather than seeking approval. They recognize all human beings as fellow citizens in the cosmic city, sharing the same rational nature and deserving moral consideration. Zeno taught that we are all brothers and sisters because we all partake of the divine reason. This made Stoicism radically egalitarian for its time. Conventional Greek society was deeply hierarchical, with citizens, non-citizens, slaves, and women occupying different social positions with different rights and expectations. But Zeno argued that these conventional distinctions are indifference. What matters is rational nature, and slaves possess this just as much as free citizens, women just as much as men, barbarians just as much as Greeks. Everyone capable of reason is capable of virtue, and virtue is the only thing that truly matters. This does not mean Zeno advocated revolutionary social change or the immediate elimination of existing social structures. The Stoics distinguished between what is ideal and what is practically achievable. In an ideal world governed perfectly by reason, there might be no slavery, no artificial hierarchies, no wars or conflicts. But in the actual world, with most people still operating from ignorance and passion, these institutions persist. The Stoic response is not to violently overthrow existing structures, but to maintain one's own virtue within them, treating even slaves with justice, and recognizing their human dignity, even while participating in institutions that fail to reflect ideal rationality. Living according to nature also means accepting the natural cycles and patterns that govern existence. Everything comes into being and passes away. Youth gives way to age, health to sickness, life to death. These changes are not evils, but natural processes. Fighting against them or resenting them is irrational, like being angry at winter for being cold or at spring for bringing rain. The wise person accepts the seasons of life, just as they accept the seasons of the year, recognizing that each has its appropriate character and challenges. Zeno taught that nature is provident, meaning that the natural order serves a good purpose, even when we cannot discern it. Difficulties and challenges are not malfunctions in the system, but features of it. They serve to test and develop virtue. A world without challenges would be a world in which virtue was impossible, because there would be no opportunity to exercise courage, endurance, justice, or wisdom. The apparently harsh aspects of nature are actually necessary for the possibility of excellence. This providential view of nature did not lead the Stoics to passive acceptance of all evils. They distinguished between natural evils, which are part of the necessary structure of reality, and human-caused evils, which result from ignorance and vice. Natural disasters, disease, aging, death, these are natural and should be accepted. But injustice, cruelty, tyranny, these are corruptions of rational nature and should be resisted. The Stoic works to eliminate evils that result from human irrationality, while accepting evils that result from natural necessity. Living according to nature, in all these senses, requires constant attention and practice. You must continually remind yourself of your place in the cosmic order, your possession of rational nature, your particular roles and relationships, and your connection to the universal community of rational beings. This comprehensive understanding transforms how you experience everything that happens, revealing it all as opportunities to express virtue in harmony with the rational structure of reality itself. Zeno recognized that the greatest obstacle to human happiness is not external circumstances, but internal disorder. We suffer not because life is difficult, but because we have false beliefs about what matters and irrational desires that can never be satisfied. The Stoic path therefore requires a fundamental transformation of our desires and emotions, what ancient philosophy called therapy of the soul. This was not therapy in the modern psychological sense, but philosophical medicine, designed to cure the soul of its diseases, the irrational passions that disturb tranquility and prevent virtue. The Stoics analyzed emotion with remarkable psychological sophistication. They distinguished between first movements and passions proper. First movements are immediate automatic reactions that happen before conscious judgment. You hear a sudden loud noise and feel a jolt of alarm. You see food when hungry and feel an impulse toward it. You suffer an insult and feel a flash of anger. These first movements are physiological responses that even the sage experiences because they are not under voluntary control. They arise from our animal nature before reason can intervene. What distinguishes the sage from the fool is what happens next. The fool gives assent to the impression that accompanies the first movement. The jolt of alarm becomes the judgment that something terrible threatens them. The impulse toward food becomes the judgment that they must have it immediately. The flash of anger becomes the judgment that they have been wronged and must retaliate. These judgments transform first movements into full passions, irrational emotions that disturb the soul and motivate destructive behavior. The sage, by contrast, withholds assent. They experience the first movement, but recognize it as a mere physiological reaction that does not require endorsement. The jolt of alarm passes without becoming fear. The impulse toward food is moderated by reason. The flash of anger is recognized as irrational and is not allowed to develop into actual anger. Zeno identified 4 primary passions that disturb the soul: appetite, fear, pleasure, and distress. Each arises from a false judgment about good and evil. Appetite is the irrational pursuit of what we falsely judge to be good. We experience appetite when we believe that some external thing, wealth, pleasure, reputation, will make us happy if we obtain it. This belief is false because externals are indifferents that cannot affect our true good. But the false belief generates an irrational craving that can never be satisfied. Even if we get what we desired, we soon desire something else, because the real problem is not that we lack something external, but that we have false beliefs about what matters. Fear is the irrational avoidance of what we falsely judge to be evil. We fear poverty, pain, death, humiliation, loss, because we believe these things would harm us. But again, this belief is false. These are indifferents that cannot touch our virtue, our only true good. Fear makes us slaves to fortune, constantly anxious about things we cannot control, taking desperate measures to avoid what we imagine would be unbearable. But if we corrected our judgment and recognized that nothing external can truly harm us, fear would dissolve. Pleasure, in the Stoic sense, is the irrational elation at obtaining what we falsely judge to be good. This is not the same as joy or satisfaction, which can be rational. Pleasure is the excessive, unstable feeling that accompanies getting something we believed would complete us. The problem with pleasure is that it is always temporary and never truly satisfying. We get what we wanted, feel a momentary high, then either fear losing it or start desiring the next thing. Pleasure is the flip side of appetite, the brief payoff that keeps the cycle of craving going. Distress is the irrational pain at losing what we falsely judged to be good or obtaining what we falsely judged to be evil. We experience distress when we lose wealth, reputation, loved ones, health, anything we mistakenly believed was genuinely good rather than merely preferred, indifferent. This distress can be overwhelming, making us feel that life is not worth living, that we have been truly harmed, that we are justified in despair. But all of this is based on the false judgment that we have lost something that matters. Correct the judgment, recognize that you have lost only an indifferent, and the distress evaporates. Zeno taught that these 4 passions and all their variants, greed, lust, anxiety, panic, grief, envy, jealousy, hatred, are diseases of the soul that must be cured through philosophical therapy. The cure is always the same: correct the false judgment that underlies the passion. Examine the impression that triggers the emotion. Does it claim that some external is truly good or evil? Reject this claim. Remind yourself that only virtue is good and only vice is evil. Recognize that what you desired, feared, obtained, or lost is merely an indifferent. This correction of judgment, practiced consistently, gradually eliminates the irrational passions. But the goal is not to become emotionless or robotic. The Stoics distinguished between irrational passions and rational feelings that they called eupatheiai, good feelings or healthy states. The sage does not experience fear, but they do experience appropriate caution about maintaining virtue. They do not experience appetite for externals, but they do experience appropriate wish for virtue and rational selection of preferred indifference. They do not experience pleasure in externals, but they do experience joy in virtuous action. They do not experience distress at losing indifference, but they might experience appropriate sadness at another's vice or suffering, though even this is mild and rational rather than overwhelming. These good feelings differ from passions in crucial ways. They are based on correct judgments about what is truly good and bad. They are moderate and stable rather than excessive and unstable. They are consistent with rationality rather than conflicting with it. And they are within voluntary control because they follow from judgments that we choose to make. The sage's emotional life is not empty, but rich and full, just purified of the false beliefs that make ordinary emotions destructive. Zeno developed specific techniques for managing desires and emotions. One of the most powerful is the practice of viewing things as they really are, stripping away the false value judgments we project onto them. We look at a fancy car and see not just a vehicle, but a symbol of success, an object of desire, something that would make us happy. The Stoic technique is to describe the car accurately without these projections. It is a metal frame with an engine designed to transport people. That is all. The desire arises not from the thing itself, but from the false beliefs we attach to it. This practice can be applied to anything. Wealth is not success or security, but just numbers representing tokens of exchange. Fame is not validation or importance, but just the attention of people you have never met. Physical beauty is not value or worth, but just certain arrangements of flesh and bone. Death is not evil or tragedy, but just the natural dissolution of the body. When you strip away false projections and see things as they are, their power over you dissolves. You can still rationally prefer some things over others, but you are no longer enslaved by desperate craving or irrational fear. Another technique is to practice indifference through voluntary discomfort. If you are afraid of poverty, live simply. If you crave pleasure, fast occasionally. If you fear pain, expose yourself to cold or exercise to exhaustion. These practices prove that what you feared was not actually unbearable, and what you craved was not actually necessary. They build up your capacity to remain tranquil, regardless of circumstances. They demonstrate experientially that externals have no power over you, unless you grant them that power through false judgment. Zeno also taught the importance of examining the consequences of desires. When you desire something, imagine getting it. Will it truly make you happy? For how long? What new problems will it create? What will you desire next? Trace the likely trajectory of fulfilling the desire, and you will see that it leads not to lasting satisfaction, but to new cravings, new anxieties, new disturbances. This examination can help break the grip of desire by revealing its futility. For dealing with the desires and emotions we already have, Zeno recommended philosophical reflection and argument with oneself. When you feel anger rising, argue against it. Has the person really harmed you? Have they diminished your virtue? Are they acting from ignorance rather than malice? Is your anger serving any constructive purpose, or merely disturbing your tranquility? When you feel anxious about the future, remind yourself that the future is not in your control, that nothing truly bad can happen as long as you maintain virtue. That anxiety itself is the only present evil you're experiencing. This internal dialogue, conducted rigorously and honestly, can diffuse irrational emotions before they take hold. The Stoics recognized that transforming desires and emotions is a gradual process. You do not become instantly free from passions simply by understanding Stoic theory. The false beliefs that generate passions are deeply ingrained through years of social conditioning and habitual thinking. They must be uprooted slowly and carefully through consistent practice. Each time you identify and correct a false judgment, you make progress. Each time you experience a disturbing emotion and trace it back to its source in false belief, you loosen that belief's grip. Zeno compared this process to treating a physical illness. You do not cure a chronic disease with a single treatment, but through a long course of therapy. Similarly, you do not cure the soul's diseases with a single philosophical insight, but through sustained practice over time. The Stoic student must be patient with themselves, recognizing that progress is real even when it is slow, and that even small improvements in managing desires and emotions represent significant victories. The ultimate goal of this therapy is what the Stoics called apatheia, freedom from passions. This is not apathy in the modern sense, not indifference or lack of caring, but the absence of irrational emotions that disturb tranquility. The sage cares deeply about virtue and about helping others achieve virtue, but they are not disturbed by external circumstances, not driven by irrational cravings, not paralyzed by irrational fears, not devastated by losses. They have achieved perfect freedom because they desire only what is within their power and accept everything else with equanimity. This freedom is not cold or inhuman, but represents the highest human flourishing. The person free from irrational passions is not less human, but more fully human, able to express reason without distortion from false beliefs, able to act effectively without interference from emotional turbulence, able to love wisely without possessiveness or anxiety, able to live fully without constant fear of loss. This is what Zeno discovered in his own transformation from shipwrecked merchant to tranquil philosopher, and what he offered to anyone willing to undertake the therapeutic work of philosophy. At the center of Zeno's philosophy stands the ideal of the sage, the perfectly wise person who has achieved complete virtue and lives in perfect harmony with nature. The sage represents what human beings can become when they fully develop their rational capacities and eliminate all false beliefs. This ideal might seem impossibly remote, a theoretical abstraction with no practical relevance. But for Zeno, the sage served a crucial function, providing a clear target that students could aim toward and a standard by which they could measure their progress. The Stoic sage possesses complete wisdom. This means they have correct understanding of the nature of reality, of what is truly good and evil, of what is up to them and what is not, of their place in the cosmic order. They never assent to false impressions because they have perfected their ability to distinguish reliable from unreliable appearances. They never make errors in judgment because their reason functions without interference from irrational impulses or false opinions. They see reality as it truly is, without the distortions that plague ordinary consciousness. This complete wisdom manifests in perfect virtue. The sage is always wise, courageous, just, and moderate. They cannot act viciously even if they wanted to, because vice is simply error about what matters, and the sage never errs. They always know what the situation calls for and always choose it. They never struggle with temptation because they do not perceive externals as genuinely tempting. They never face moral dilemmas because they understand clearly what virtue requires in every circumstance. The sage experiences complete tranquility, ataraxia. Nothing external disturbs them because they recognize that nothing external affects their true good. They do not fear death, poverty, pain, or any other seeming evil, because they know these are indifferents. They do not crave wealth, pleasure, or any other apparent good, because they know these cannot add to their happiness. They accept whatever fate brings with perfect equanimity, knowing that what happens is necessary, and that they can respond virtuously, regardless of what occurs. Their mind is like a calm lake that no wind can disturb, perfectly still and clear. The sage is also completely free, possessing what the Stoics called autarkia, self-sufficiency. They depend on nothing external for their happiness. They can be content in any circumstances, with any resources or lack thereof, with company or in solitude, in health or sickness, in prosperity or poverty. This is not because they are insensitive or lacking in feelings, but because they have correctly identified what they truly need, only virtue, and virtue is always available regardless of external conditions. This self-sufficiency is the ultimate freedom, because it makes you invulnerable to fortune's changes. Zeno taught that the sage is perfectly happy, eudaimon. This is not happiness in the sense of feeling pleasure or enjoying favorable circumstances, but happiness in the sense of flourishing, of achieving one's full potential as a rational being. The sage has everything they need because they have virtue. They lack nothing because they desire only what is within their power. The happiness is stable and permanent because it does not depend on anything that can be taken away. Even in the worst external circumstances, imprisoned, tortured, facing death, the sage remains happy because virtue remains. The sage also possesses perfect freedom of speech, parrhesia. They say what they think without fear of consequences because they are indifferent to external punishment. They speak truth plainly because they have no need to manipulate or deceive. They can advise rulers honestly because they do not need the ruler's favor. They can criticize injustice boldly because they do not fear retaliation. This makes the sage an invaluable friend and advisor, someone who will always tell you the truth rather than what you want to hear. Zeno described the sage as truly wealthy despite potentially owning nothing material. True wealth is not possessing many things, but needing few things, and the sage needs only virtue. They are truly beautiful, because virtue is the only real beauty. They are truly noble, because virtue is the only genuine nobility. They are truly a king because they rule themselves perfectly. All the qualities that people conventionally value in those who possess external advantages, the sage possesses through virtue alone. The sage's relationships are characterized by rational affection rather than irrational passion. They love their family and friends, but this love is not possessive or anxious. They want what is best for those they love, which means they want them to be virtuous, but they do not need them to be happy or to validate themselves. They grieve when loved ones die, but this grief is appropriate and moderate, not the overwhelming distress that destroys those who mistake loved ones for genuine goods. They can maintain friendships with other sages based on mutual recognition of virtue, the purest form of human connection. The sage is also a perfect citizen and contributor to society. They fulfill all appropriate social roles with excellence. If they are a ruler, they govern justly and wisely. If they are a subject, they obey just laws and resist unjust ones appropriately. If they are a parent, they raise their children to value virtue. If they are a teacher, they guide students toward wisdom. They participate fully in social life while maintaining complete internal freedom, never sacrificing virtue for social approval or material advantage. Zeno acknowledged that perfect sages are extremely rare, perhaps non-existent. He may have doubted whether anyone in his own time had achieved complete wisdom, including himself. Some Stoics suggested that perfect sages might appear once in many generations, citing Socrates as a possible example. Others thought the sage was more of a theoretical ideal than a practically achievable state, useful for guidance even if never fully realized. But this rarity does not make the ideal useless. Even if you never become a perfect sage, you can make continual progress toward wisdom. You can identify and correct false beliefs, strengthen your capacity for rational choice, develop virtue in various areas of life, and achieve increasing tranquility and freedom. Each step toward wisdom is valuable, even if you never reach perfect wisdom. Each improvement in managing emotions represents real progress. Each day lived more virtuously than the day before is a success. The Stoics distinguished between the sage and the Procopiton, the person making progress. Most Stoic students, including perhaps Zeno himself, were Procopitontes, people working toward wisdom rather than having fully achieved it. The Procopiton still experiences irrational emotions occasionally, but with decreasing frequency and intensity. They still make errors in judgment, but catch and correct them more quickly. They still find some circumstances more challenging than others, but handle difficulties with growing equanimity. They are not yet wise, but they are becoming wiser. Zeno taught that this progress is valuable and should be celebrated. Even though there is a sharp boundary between sage and fool, with no middle ground in terms of perfect wisdom, there are degrees of foolishness. The person who has studied philosophy for years and worked on correcting false beliefs is much closer to wisdom than someone who has never questioned conventional opinions, even if both technically remain fools. Every step forward matters. Every false belief corrected is a real achievement. Every improvement in virtue is genuinely good. The sage ideal also served a practical function in Stoic education. When facing a difficult decision or challenging circumstance, Zeno taught students to ask themselves, what would the sage do? How would the perfectly wise person respond to this situation? This thought experiment helps clarify what virtue requires, because the sage always does what is virtuous. Even if you cannot yet respond as the sage would, imagining their response provides guidance for your own choice. The Stoics also used the sage ideal to make sense of virtue's unity. They taught that all virtues are aspects of one unified wisdom. The sage who has wisdom necessarily has courage, justice, and moderation as well, because these are just different expressions of the same rational excellence. You cannot be perfectly wise yet cowardly, because cowardice involves false judgment about what to fear. You cannot be perfectly wise yet unjust, because injustice involves false judgment about what others deserve. Perfect wisdom entails all virtue, and perfect virtue is always unified. This means that the sage never experiences genuine moral conflict. Situations that seem to require choosing between virtues, such as choosing between honesty and loyalty, are only conflicts when you are still operating with incomplete wisdom. The sage would understand what the situation genuinely calls for and would see that what appears to be conflicting virtues are actually a single virtuous response properly understood. Moral dilemmas arise from confusion about what virtue requires, confusion that the sage never experiences. The sage ideal also addressed the problem of moral luck. Conventional morality suggests that circumstances affect how virtuous your actions are. A general who wins battles through luck is praised more than one who loses, despite making excellent decisions. A doctor whose patients survive through chance is considered more skilled than one whose patients die, despite receiving superior treatment. But this means virtue depends partly on factors outside your control, making it vulnerable to fortune. The Stoic sage escapes this problem entirely. Their virtue consists in making correct choices based on proper understanding. Whether those choices lead to conventionally successful outcomes is irrelevant. The sage who attempted to save their city, but failed due to circumstances beyond their control, is just as virtuous as one who succeeded. Zeno's sage represents the fully realized human being, the person who has achieved everything that makes life worth living. This ideal remains relevant because it challenges us to question our own values and assumptions. When we compare our priorities to those of the sage, we see how much of what we care about is based on false beliefs. When we imagine responding to difficulties with the sage's tranquility and wisdom, we recognize how much of our suffering is self-created. The sage shows us what we could become if we did the difficult work of philosophy, and that vision can inspire and guide us, even if we never fully attain it. One of the most challenging aspects of Stoic philosophy concerns the relationship between fate and human freedom. Zeno taught that everything that happens is determined by prior causes in an unbreakable chain, extending back to the beginning of time and forward to its end. The universe is governed by divine reason, and everything unfolds according to necessity. Yet Zeno also insisted that human beings are responsible for their choices, and that virtue consists in freely choosing good over evil. How can both claims be true? If everything is fated, how can we be free? If we are free, how can everything be determined? This apparent paradox troubled critics of Stoicism in ancient times and continues to challenge readers today. Zeno's solution begins with his understanding of fate. Fate is not an external force imposing events on an otherwise chaotic universe. Rather, fate is the internal rational principle through which the universe organizes itself. To say that something is fated is to say that it follows necessarily from the nature of reality and the causal chains that constitute the universe's rational order. This is very different from the common notion of fate as arbitrary decree or external compulsion. The Stoics use the analogy of a dog tied to a cart. The cart is moving in a specific direction, pulled by horses. The dog is tied to the cart with a leash. The dog has a choice about how to relate to this situation. It can recognize where the cart is going and run alongside it willingly, or it can resist and be dragged along painfully. Either way, the cart goes where it is going, and the dog ends up at the same destination. But the dog's experience of the journey depends entirely on its choice to cooperate or resist. Similarly, fate determines what happens in the external world. Events unfold according to the causal order established by divine reason. You cannot change what will happen any more than the dog can change where the cart is going. But you can choose how you respond to what happens. You can accept events willingly, aligning your will with the necessity of things, or you can resist and suffer. Your external destination, the events that occur, is the same either way. But your internal experience, whether you maintain tranquility or experience distress, depends entirely on your choice. This analogy helps clarify the Stoic position, but it does not fully resolve the puzzle. If the dog's choice to cooperate or resist is itself determined by prior causes, in what sense is it really a choice? Zeno's answer involves distinguishing between different types of causes and showing that even in a deterministic universe, some things are up to us in the sense that matters for responsibility. The Stoics distinguish between external causes and internal causes. External causes are events and circumstances that happen to us, things outside our control. Internal causes are the judgments and choices we make in response to external circumstances. While external causes are completely determined by fate, internal causes, though also determined in a sense, are determined by our own nature as rational beings. They flow from who we are rather than being imposed from outside. Consider an example. You lose your job due to economic conditions beyond your control. This external event is fated, determined by the causal chains of economic forces. But how you respond to losing your job is determined by your character, your beliefs, your values. If you believe that your job was your only source of worth and meaning, you will respond with despair. If you recognize that your true good lies in virtue rather than employment, you will respond with equanimity. The external event was not up to you. But your judgment about what it means was up to you, not in the sense that you could have judged differently, given who you are and what you believe, but in the sense that it flows from your internal nature, rather than being externally imposed. This might seem like a thin notion of freedom, but Zeno argued it is the only coherent one and the only one that matters for ethics. What makes you responsible for your actions is not that you could have done otherwise in some absolute metaphysical sense. Rather, it is that your actions flow from your character, from the judgments and beliefs that constitute who you are. When we praise virtue or blame vice, we are praising or blaming the person for being a certain way, for having a character that produces certain choices. The Stoics also distinguished between fate and necessity in another important sense. Something that is fated will certainly happen, but it may not happen necessarily in the logical sense. The distinction is subtle but important. Logical necessity means that the opposite is impossible, like 2 plus 2 equaling something other than 4. But many events are fated to happen without being logically necessary. They happen because of the causal conditions that led to them, but we can coherently imagine them not happening if those conditions had been different. This distinction helped the Stoics respond to the lazy argument, which says, if everything is fated, there is no point in trying to do anything. If I am fated to recover from illness, I will recover whether I call a doctor or not. If I am fated to die from illness, I will die whether I seek treatment or not. Therefore, I might as well do nothing. Zeno's response was that this reasoning confuses fate with logical necessity and ignores the fact that your actions are part of the causal chain that determines outcomes. If you are fated to recover, you are fated to recover because you will take appropriate actions, like calling a doctor. If you are fated to die, it is because you will not take those actions, or because they will not succeed. Your actions are not separate from fate, but a part of how fate operates. The outcome is determined, but it is determined partly by what you do. This is what the Stoics called confated, things that are fated to happen together. Your recovery and your calling the doctor are confated, both determined by the same causal chain. This analysis preserves meaningful human agency within a deterministic framework. You should deliberate, make plans, take action, because these activities are themselves parts of the causal order that determines outcomes. The fact that outcomes are determined does not make your choices irrelevant. Your choices are among the causes that determine what happens, even though your choices themselves are determined by prior causes, including your character and beliefs. Zeno also emphasized that divine providence governs the universe for the best. Everything that happens is arranged by divine wisdom for the optimal functioning of the whole. This does not mean that everything that happens is good from every individual perspective. Bad things happen to individuals. People suffer, experience injustice, die young, face terrible circumstances. But from the perspective of the whole, everything serves a purpose in the rational order of the cosmos. The Stoics compared the universe to a beautifully constructed drama. In a good play, some characters suffer, some meet tragic ends, some play villains who do terrible things. These events are not flaws in the play but necessary for the dramatic coherence and meaning of the whole. Similarly, in the cosmic drama, individuals experience what seem like evils from their limited perspective, but these apparent evils contribute to the perfect rationality of the whole. The playwright arranges everything for the good of the play, even if individual characters experience suffering. This view of providence does not make evil illusory or unimportant. Real evils occur, genuine suffering happens, and we should work to reduce unnecessary suffering where we can. But it does provide a perspective from which even apparent evils can be accepted as part of a larger good that we may not fully comprehend. The sage trusts divine providence, even when they cannot see how particular evils serve the good of the whole. Zeno taught that accepting fate is not passive resignation, but active cooperation with the rational order of reality. The phrase amor fati, though coined by later philosophers, captures this Stoic attitude perfectly. Love what is fated. When something happens, do not waste energy wishing it had not happened or resenting that it did. Recognize that it was fated, that it flows from the nature of things, that resisting it changes nothing except your inner state. Instead, embrace what happens as an opportunity to exercise virtue in response. This acceptance extends even to death. Death is fated for everyone, coming at a time determined by the causal order. The sage does not fear death, because they recognize it as a natural necessity, no more evil than any other natural process. They may prefer to live longer, all else equal, because life provides opportunities for virtuous action. But they do not cling desperately to life or view death as a catastrophe. When death comes, they accept it as willingly as they accept anything else that fate brings. The Stoic view of fate and Providence provided profound consolation to those facing difficult circumstances. If you understand that what happens is determined by divine wisdom for the good of the whole, you can maintain tranquility even in the worst situations. You know that your suffering serves some purpose in the cosmic order, even if you cannot discern what that purpose is. You know that nothing truly bad has happened to you because only vice is truly bad, and vice is always within your power to avoid. You can focus your energy on responding virtuously to circumstances rather than wasting it on futile resistance or bitter resentment. This worldview also fostered a deep sense of cosmic belonging. You are not a random accident in an indifferent universe, but an essential part of a rational cosmic order. Everything you experience, including difficulties and suffering, connects you to the whole and serves purposes larger than yourself. When you align your will with fate, you are aligning yourself with divine reason, participating consciously in the rational governance of reality. This gives profound meaning and dignity to even the smallest human life and the most challenging circumstances. Zeno's teaching about fate and freedom provided the intellectual foundation for Stoic tranquility and acceptance. It showed how to maintain moral responsibility and meaningful human agency while acknowledging the determined nature of reality. It revealed how to love what is fated while still striving to act virtuously. And it explained how to find meaning and purpose in a universe governed entirely by necessity. These insights remain valuable for anyone seeking to reconcile the apparent conflict between accepting what is and striving for what should be. Zeno's philosophy radically challenged the conventional boundaries that divided human beings in the ancient world. Greek society was organized around the polis, the city-state, and Greeks generally viewed their own cities as the primary focus of loyalty and obligation. Citizens owed duties to fellow citizens, but barbarians, foreigners who did not speak Greek, were considered naturally inferior. Slavery was accepted as natural. Women had limited rights and status, and rigid hierarchies structured all social relationships. Into this world, Zeno introduced a revolutionary idea. All human beings are fellow citizens in a universal city, the cosmopolis, and all share equal dignity as rational beings. This cosmopolitan vision emerged directly from Stoic physics and ethics. If the universe is governed by divine reason, and if human beings participate in that reason through their rational capacity, then all humans share something essential and valuable. Reason is reason, regardless of whether it exists in a Greek or a barbarian, a citizen or a slave, a man or a woman, a rich person or a poor one. The conventional distinctions that organize society are indifferent with respect to what truly matters. What makes a person valuable is not their social status or cultural background, but their capacity for reason and virtue. Zeno expressed this vision in his early work, The Republic, which has not survived but was discussed by later ancient writers. In this provocative book, Zeno imagined an ideal society governed entirely by reason rather than by conventional customs and arbitrary distinctions. In Zeno's ideal republic, there would be no separate city-states with their competing loyalties and inevitable conflicts. Instead, all rational beings would recognize themselves as citizens of one universal community, united by their shared rational nature. There would be no distinction between Greeks and barbarians, because these are conventional categories that have no basis in nature. There would be no slavery, because enslaving a rational being contradicts the recognition of their essential dignity. Men and women would have equal status, because both possess reason equally. This was an astonishingly radical vision for its time. Zeno was not proposing minor reforms to existing social structures, but imagining a complete transformation based on consistently following the implications of Stoic principles. If virtue is the only good and vice the only evil, if all externals, including social status, are indifference, if reason is what makes humans valuable, then conventional social hierarchies are arbitrary and unjustified. They may serve practical purposes or reflect historical developments, but they have no grounding in the nature of things. Zeno's cosmopolitanism found expression in the Stoic doctrine of oikeiosis, usually translated as appropriation or familiarization. This concept describes the natural process by which rational beings extend their concern outward in widening circles. We begin with natural self-concern, caring about our own preservation and well-being. This then extends to our immediate family, as we recognize them as extensions of ourselves and care for them naturally. From family, concern extends to friends, neighbors, fellow citizens, and ultimately to all rational beings as members of the universal human family. The goal of moral development is to make this extension complete and rational. We should care for all human beings as we care for our family, recognizing that they too are fellow citizens in the cosmopolis. This does not mean treating strangers exactly as we treat our children, because appropriate action varies with relationship and circumstance. A parent has special responsibilities to their children that they do not have to strangers. But it does mean recognizing that the stranger has the same essential value and dignity as your child, and that their welfare matters morally, even if you have no personal connection to them. Zeno used a famous image to illustrate this progression. Imagine a series of concentric circles. You stand at the center. The first circle around you contains your immediate family. The next circle contains extended family, then friends, then neighbors, then fellow citizens, then people from your region, then your nation, then all humanity. The work of philosophy is to draw these circles together, to bring the outer circles closer to the center, until you care for all humanity, with something approaching the concern you feel for your family. This cosmopolitan ethics had immediate practical implications. If all human beings are fellow citizens, then we have obligations to all of them, not just to our immediate community. When we see injustice anywhere, we should care about it, because it affects our fellow citizens in the universal city. When we see suffering anywhere, we should feel moved to help if we can, because those suffering are our brothers and sisters in rationality. We cannot simply ignore what happens beyond our city walls or national borders, claiming it is none of our concern. The Stoic recognizes no fundamental boundary between us and them, because we are all equally members of the cosmopolis. Zeno's cosmopolitanism also implied a natural law that transcends the conventional laws of particular societies. Conventional law varies from place to place and reflects the specific customs and decisions of particular communities. But natural law flows from reason itself and applies equally to all rational beings everywhere. Natural law commands us to pursue virtue and avoid vice, to treat rational beings with justice, to fulfill our natural roles and relationships appropriately. These obligations are not created by social convention, but are grounded in the nature of reality itself. This distinction between natural and conventional law provided a basis for criticizing unjust social institutions and customs. When conventional law conflicts with natural law takes priority. A law that commands vice or forbids virtue is not truly a law, but a corruption of law. A citizen may have an obligation to disobey unjust conventional laws in order to obey the higher natural law. This gave the Stoics a principled basis for resistance to tyranny and injustice that was unusual in the ancient world. Zeno's cosmopolitanism also shaped the Stoic understanding of social roles and relationships. We are not simply isolated individuals, but nodes in a vast network of relationships. We are simultaneously children, siblings, parents, friends, citizens, human beings. Each relationship creates appropriate duties and obligations. Virtue involves fulfilling these roles excellently, responding appropriately to each relationship and situation. But all these particular roles are nested within our fundamental identity as rational beings and citizens of the cosmopolis. This meant that particular loyalties should never lead us to act unjustly or to fail to recognize the humanity of those outside our immediate group. A good Greek should love their city, but this love should not make them blind to justice or lead them to treat barbarians cruelly. A good parent should care for their children, but this should not make them indifferent to other people's children. Particular loyalties are natural and appropriate, but they must be guided by the universal obligation of justice to all rational beings. The Stoics developed a vision of the ideal human community that influenced later Western thought profoundly. They imagined a society in which all members would be bound together not by force or fear, but by rational recognition of their common nature and common good. Such a society would need no elaborate laws, because everyone would be guided by reason and virtue. There would be no conflict because everyone would understand that true good lies in virtue rather than in competing for limited external resources. Everyone would contribute to the common good because they would recognize themselves as parts of the whole. This ideal was explicitly utopian, not expected to be realized in actual human societies given the prevalence of ignorance and vice. But it served as a standard against which existing societies could be judged and a goal toward which they could strive. Even if perfect rational community is impossible, we can make progress toward it by reducing arbitrary barriers between people, extending justice more widely, and educating people to recognize their common humanity. Zeno's cosmopolitan vision had a democratic dimension as well. If all rational beings have equal fundamental value, then political authority cannot be justified by appeals to inherent superiority of birth, wealth, or other conventional distinctions. Leaders should be those who possess wisdom and virtue, and they should rule for the common good rather than their own advantage. While the Stoics did not advocate democracy in the modern sense, they rejected the legitimacy of rule based on anything other than excellence in promoting virtue and justice. This cosmopolitanism extended beyond the human sphere. The Stoics taught that we are also connected to animals, plants, and the entire natural world as parts of the cosmos. While only rational beings can be fully virtuous, we should treat all of nature with respect as part of the divine order. We may use animals and plants for legitimate needs, but we should not be cruel or wasteful. We should recognize our responsibilities as rational beings to care for the world we inhabit, not because nature exists merely for our benefit, but because we are parts of a larger whole. In practice, living as a cosmopolitan citizen meant maintaining awareness of your connection to all humanity. When you encountered someone from a different culture, you recognized them as a fellow human rather than an alien other. When you heard of injustice in a distant place, you recognized it as your concern. When you had to choose between what served your narrow self-interest and what served the common good, you chose the latter. You saw yourself not as an isolated individual, or merely as a member of your particular community, but as part of the universal human family. This vision was both inspiring and demanding. Inspiring because it elevated human beings above the petty divisions that create so much conflict and suffering. Demanding because it required overcoming deeply ingrained tribal instincts and conventional prejudices. Zeno asked people to expand their circle of concern far beyond what came naturally, to care for distant strangers as they care for neighbors, to recognize common humanity across vast differences in custom and culture. The Stoic cosmopolitan ideal would later influence Roman law, Christian universalism, Enlightenment ideas about human rights, and modern conceptions of global justice. Whenever we assert that all human beings have inherent dignity regardless of race, nationality, gender, or social status, we echo Zeno's fundamental insight. Whenever we recognize obligations that transcend national boundaries, we apply Stoic cosmopolitanism. Whenever we appeal to universal moral principles that apply to all people everywhere, we invoke the Stoic concept of natural law. Zeno's cosmopolitanism emerged from the same shipwreck that birthed his philosophy. Losing his Phoenician merchant identity, washing up in Greek Athens, studying with philosophers from various schools, Zeno experienced firsthand the arbitrariness of conventional boundaries. He discovered that wisdom could come from cynic beggars as well as from academic aristocrats, that virtue was possible for foreigners as well as citizens, that the only community that ultimately mattered was the community of reason. This lived experience of crossing boundaries gave depth and authenticity to his philosophical universalism. The cosmopolitan vision remains one of Stoicism's most important contributions to human thought. In our contemporary world, where global connection makes the interdependence of all people increasingly obvious, Zeno's insight that we are all citizens of one universal community has never been more relevant. His challenge to recognize our common humanity across differences, to extend justice and concern universally, and to identify with the whole rather than merely with the part, continues to inspire those seeking a more just and unified world. For Zeno, philosophy was fundamentally preparation for death. This sounds morbid to modern ears, accustomed to viewing death as the ultimate evil to be avoided, denied, or at least not discussed. But Zeno taught that learning to die well is essential to learning to live well. Death is not an evil, but a natural necessity that comes to everyone. Our attitude toward death shapes our entire experience of life. Those who fear death are enslaved to that fear, making desperate choices to postpone what cannot be avoided. Those who accept death with equanimity are freed to live fully, making choices based on virtue rather than on the futile attempt to extend existence indefinitely. The Stoic view of death begins with recognizing it as an indifferent. Death is neither good nor bad in itself. It is simply the natural dissolution of the compound that constitutes a living body. The materials that temporarily formed your body return to the cosmos to be reconfigured into other forms. Nothing is truly destroyed, because the substance of the universe is eternal and indestructible. Forms change, compounds dissolve and reform, but the underlying material and the rational principle that organizes it persist eternally. Your death is no more tragic or evil than autumn leaves falling from trees, part of the endless cycle of natural transformation. This does not mean death is not different from life, or that we should be indifferent between living and dying. Life is a preferred indifferent. It provides opportunities for virtuous action, for relationships, for expressing reason and contributing to the community. All else being equal, it is natural to prefer living to dying. But this preference should not become desperate clinging. When death comes, either through natural causes, illness, accident, or any other means, it should be accepted as willingly as any other natural event. The time and manner of death are not up to us. How we meet death is entirely up to us. Zeno taught that the sage views death as a matter of complete indifference. If death comes today, that is fine. If it comes decades from now, that is fine too. The sage lives each day fully, as if it might be their last, but without anxiety about when the end will arrive. They make no desperate bargains to extend life a little longer. They accept whatever fate brings, knowing that the length of life isn't indifferent, but the virtue with which they live it is everything. This attitude toward death has profound implications for how we live. If you truly accept that death could come at any moment, and that this would be perfectly natural and acceptable, then you cannot postpone living virtuously. You cannot tell yourself that you will develop courage later, that you will work on wisdom tomorrow, that you will start living according to your values after you achieve some external goal. Later may never come. Tomorrow you might be dead. The only time to be virtuous is now. The Stoics practice regular contemplation of death. Each morning, Zeno taught, remind yourself that this might be your last day. Imagine your death in vivid detail. Picture your final moments. Consider how you want to be remembered and what kind of person you want to be when death arrives. This practice, far from being depressing, focuses your attention on what truly matters. It cuts through trivial concerns and clarifies priorities. When you remember that you will die, you stop wasting time on things that do not matter and focus on things that do. This practice also reduces fear. The unknown is always more frightening than the familiar. By regularly contemplating death, you familiarize yourself with it. You rehearse in imagination what you will experience in reality. When death actually arrives, it will not be shocking or terrifying, but expected and prepared for. You will have practiced dying countless times in your mind, making the actual experience less overwhelming. Zeno distinguished between the event of death itself and the fears and anxieties about death that poison life. The event of death, when it comes, is morally neutral and should be accepted calmly. But the fears about death that trouble people throughout their lives are genuine evils, not because death is evil, but because irrational fear disturbs tranquility and prevents virtue. Someone who spends their life terrified of death has already been destroyed by death long before it arrives. They have sacrificed their present peace to futile anxiety about a future event they cannot control. Most fear of death is really fear of the wrong things. People fear the pain that might accompany dying, but pain is temporary, and the sage maintains equanimity through pain. People fear leaving loved ones behind, but if we have taught them virtue, they will be fine, and if we have not, our continued presence would not help them. People fear missing out on future experiences, but every moment you are alive, you could experience more. This fear is never satisfied and makes every moment anxious. People fear non-existence, but non-existence is not an experience at all. You will not be there to suffer from not existing. There is no you that continues in a state of deprivation. Zeno taught that death often comes as a welcome release. Life inevitably brings suffering, difficulty, and moral challenges. At some point, for many people, the burdens of continued existence outweigh its benefits. The sage recognizes when this point arrives and can accept death gladly, like leaving a crowded theater or putting down a heavy burden. This is not a morbid death wish, but a realistic recognition that existence is not valuable for its own sake, but only insofar as it provides opportunities for virtue. The Stoics even recognized the possibility of rational suicide. If circumstances become such that virtue is impossible, or that continued life serves no purpose, the sage may choose to exit. This was not considered shameful or cowardly, but a final rational choice. However, the bar for rational suicide was extremely high. Simple suffering, disappointment, or difficulty would never justify it, because these are opportunities for virtue. Only if virtue itself became impossible, perhaps through severe mental incapacity or irresistible compulsion to act viciously, would suicide become the appropriate choice. Zeno's own death, according to legend, reflected this attitude. When he tripped and injured his finger, he took it as a sign that his time had come. He had lived a long life devoted to philosophy and virtue. His work was done. There was no reason to cling to existence longer. So he held his breath until he died, peacefully and deliberately choosing his moment of exit. Whether this story is literally true or not, it captures how the Stoics viewed death as a natural conclusion that could be met with complete calm. The Stoic view of death also addressed what happens after death, if anything. Zeno taught that the universe goes through eternal cycles of creation and destruction. At the end of each cosmic cycle, everything is consumed in a great conflagration, returning to the divine fire from which it emerged. Then a new cycle begins, with the cosmos reformed and everything repeating according to the same rational pattern. This meant that in some sense you would live again, or rather, the pattern that constitutes you would be instantiated again in future cosmic cycles. But whether there is personal survival of death in any meaningful sense remained unclear in Stoic teaching. Some Stoics suggested that the souls of the wise might persist longer than those of fools, perhaps until the cosmic conflagration. Others suggested that individual personality dissolves at death, with only the rational principle returning to the cosmic whole. Still others were agnostic about what happens after death, considering it unknowable and irrelevant to how we should live. What mattered was not what happens after death, but how we live before it. This uncertainty about afterlife was actually a strength of Stoic ethics. If you live virtuously because you expect rewards in an afterlife or fear punishments, then your virtue is not really virtue, but disguised self-interest. True virtue is chosen for its own sake, because it is the right way to live, regardless of what consequences it might bring. The Stoic lives virtuously, whether death brings annihilation, persistence, or transformation, because virtue is worth choosing, regardless of what follows. Zeno's teaching about death aimed to liberate people from the tyranny of mortality. Most humans are enslaved by death, spending their lives in futile attempts to avoid or postpone it, making compromises with vice to extend existence a little longer, sacrificing present virtue for the illusion of future security. But death cannot be avoided, and seeking security in longevity is irrational. The only genuine security comes from virtue, which death cannot touch. Live virtuously now, accept death whenever it comes, and you are truly free from mortality's power. This freedom transforms how you engage with life. When you are not desperately clinging to existence, you can take appropriate risks for virtue. When you do not fear death, you cannot be intimidated or controlled by threats. When you accept that your time is limited, you use it wisely rather than squandering it on trivialities. Paradoxically, accepting death fully allows you to live more fully, engaging with each moment without the shadow of fear. The practice of contemplating mortality remains one of Stoicism's most powerful techniques for focusing attention on what matters. In our contemporary culture, which systematically denies death and pretends that we might live forever, Zeno's insistence on confronting mortality directly offers a necessary correction. Remembering that you will die clarifies what deserves your time and energy. It reveals the triviality of most conflicts and anxieties. It highlights the preciousness of each moment and the importance of living virtuously now, rather than postponing authentic life indefinitely. Zeno discovered through his own brush with death in the shipwreck that losing everything external, including nearly losing life itself, could reveal what truly matters. Death, whether escaped or embraced, becomes a teacher when approached philosophically. It shows that external things, including life itself, are all temporary and vulnerable to loss. The only thing that endures, the only thing truly worth cultivating, is virtue. This is the art of living that Stoicism teaches, to live so that when death arrives, you can meet it without regret, having lived well regardless of how long you lived. Zeno died around 262 BCE, but his philosophical legacy has proven remarkably resilient, surviving for over 2 millennia and finding renewed relevance in each era that rediscovers it. The school he founded continued in Athens for nearly 500 years after his death, developing and refining Stoic doctrine through generations of brilliant philosophers. The Stoicism that spread throughout the ancient world bore Zeno's stamp in its fundamental structure and insights, even as later thinkers elaborated and modified his teachings. After Zeno's death, leadership of the Stoic school passed to Cleanthes, one of his devoted students. Cleanthes was known for his piety and for his beautiful hymn to Zeus, which expressed Stoic theology in poetic form. He was followed by Chrysippus, the most systematic and prolific Stoic philosopher, who wrote over 700 books and refined Stoic logic and physics to such a degree that later philosophers said, if there had been no Chrysippus, there would have been no Stoa. These early Stoics, now called the early Stoa, established Stoicism as a major philosophical school comparable to Plato's Academy and Aristotle's Lyceum. Stoicism spread beyond Athens to the wider Hellenistic world. As Greek culture diffused following Alexander the Great's conquests, Greek philosophy reached new audiences throughout the Mediterranean and Near East. Stoicism, with its emphasis on virtue, accessible to everyone, regardless of circumstances, appealed particularly to those facing the uncertainties and disruptions of the Hellenistic age. When traditional city-states lost independence to larger kingdoms and empires, when social structures changed rapidly, when people found themselves uprooted and disconnected from traditional sources of meaning, Stoicism offered an inner fortress that external changes could not breach. Stoicism found its most famous expressions in the Roman world. The Middle Stoa, represented by philosophers like Panaetius and Posidonius, adapted Stoic teaching for Roman audiences, making it more practical and less technical than the abstract systematizing of the early Stoa. These philosophers influenced the Roman elite, showing how Stoic principles could guide political leadership and social responsibility. Through them, Stoicism became the unofficial philosophy of the Roman ruling class. The late Stoa, from which most surviving Stoic texts come, produced three of the most influential Stoic voices. Seneca, a wealthy Roman advisor to the Emperor Nero, wrote eloquent letters and essays applying Stoic principles to everyday life. Epictetus, who was born a slave and gained freedom only later in life, taught that true freedom comes from within and depends on nothing external. Marcus Aurelius, emperor of Rome at its height, kept a private journal, now known as the Meditations, in which he reminded himself of Stoic principles while shouldering the enormous responsibilities of imperial rule. These three represented radically different social positions: wealthy aristocrat, former slave, emperor, yet all found in Stoicism, a philosophy that addressed their deepest needs. This demonstrated Zeno's fundamental insight that virtue is accessible to everyone and that external circumstances are indifferent to what truly matters. Stoicism provided guidance for slaves and emperors, for those with everything and those with nothing, because it focused on what is always within our power, regardless of circumstances, our choice, our judgment, our character. When Christianity became the dominant force in Western culture, Stoic philosophy did not disappear, but was absorbed and transformed. Many early Christian thinkers found Stoic ethics compatible with Christian teaching, particularly the emphasis on virtue, acceptance of providence, and the equality of all souls before God. the Stoic idea of natural law influencing Christian moral theology. The Stoic concept of universal human dignity shaped Christian views on charity and justice. The Stoic practices of self-examination and contemplation found echoes in Christian spiritual disciplines. During the Renaissance, as classical texts were rediscovered, Stoicism enjoyed renewed interest among humanist scholars. They found in Stoic texts a nobility of spirit and practical wisdom that addressed human concerns without requiring Christian faith. The Stoic emphasis on reason, self-mastery, and human dignity appealed to Renaissance thinkers who were recovering classical culture while maintaining Christian commitments. Stoicism provided a bridge between ancient wisdom and Christian virtue. The Enlightenment brought another wave of Stoic influence. Philosophers seeking to establish ethics on rational foundations, independent of religious authority, found inspiration in Stoic natural law and the idea that reason could discover moral truth. The Stoic cosmopolitan vision influenced Enlightenment ideas about human rights and universal principles of justice. The Stoic emphasis on self-governance shaped emerging democratic ideals and concepts of individual autonomy. Even as academic philosophy moved away from Stoic systematic thought, Stoic practical ethics continued to influence Western moral culture. The idea that we should focus on what is within our control while accepting what is not has become almost proverbial. The notion that virtue is its own reward and that external goods cannot guarantee happiness shapes much popular moral reasoning. The practice of examining our judgments and taking responsibility for our responses, rather than blaming circumstances, has become standard in psychology and self-help literature. In recent decades, Stoicism has experienced a remarkable revival. Modern readers have rediscovered ancient Stoic texts and found them surprisingly relevant to contemporary concerns. Cognitive behavioral therapy, one of the most effective forms of modern psychotherapy, draws directly on Stoic insights about how changing thought patterns can change emotional responses. The Stoic distinction between what is and is not in our control provides a framework for managing anxiety and maintaining focus on what matters. Stoic practices like negative visualization and voluntary discomfort have found application in everything from business strategy to military training to personal development. This modern Stoic revival reflects something important about Zeno's achievement. He created not just a philosophy for his own time, but a framework for addressing perennial human concerns. Every era faces uncertainty about the future. Every generation experiences circumstances beyond individual control. Every person confronts the challenge of finding meaning and maintaining dignity in difficult situations. Zeno's shipwreck was his personal crisis, but it represents metaphorically the shipwrecks that everyone faces in various forms. His discovery that inner freedom can survive and even be revealed by external catastrophe remains as valuable now as it was 23 centuries ago. The contemporary relevance of Stoicism extends across many domains. In professional life, Stoic principles help people focus on performing well in their roles rather than obsessing over outcomes they cannot control. An athlete cannot control whether they win, but they can control their preparation and effort. A business person cannot control market conditions, but they can control their integrity and strategic choices. Focusing on what is up to you while accepting what is not reduces anxiety and improves performance. In personal relationships, Stoic wisdom reminds us that we cannot control other people, but only our own responses and choices. We cannot make someone love us, but we can choose to love wisely. We cannot prevent loss, but we can prepare ourselves to handle it without being destroyed. We cannot control how others treat us, but we can control whether we respond virtuously or viciously. This clarity about what is and is not possible prevents many relationship conflicts and disappointments. In facing social and political challenges, Stoic cosmopolitanism offers a vision of human unity beneath surface differences. The Stoic commitment to justice rooted in natural law provides grounds for criticizing injustice regardless of cultural relativism. The Stoic focus on virtue rather than external outcomes helps activists maintain commitment even when progress seems slow or impossible. The Stoic acceptance of what cannot be changed while working diligently on what can be changed prevents both despair and naive utopianism. For personal psychological well-being, Stoic practices offer tools that modern research has validated as effective. The discipline of examining and challenging automatic thoughts, central to cognitive therapy, is essentially the Stoic practice of examining and withholding assent from unreliable impressions. The practice of gratitude, now widely recognized as promoting psychological health, echoes the Stoic practices of negative visualization and recognizing that everything we have is temporary and could be lost. The emphasis on focusing on what you can control, fundamental to managing anxiety, is pure Stoic wisdom. In confronting existential questions about meaning and purpose, Stoicism offers an approach that neither requires religious faith nor descends into nihilism. If virtue is objectively valuable, if reason discovers rather than creates moral truth, if humans have a nature that flourishes through certain activities and withers through others, then life has meaning and purpose grounded in the nature of reality itself. This meaning is available to anyone who develops their rational capacities and chooses virtue, regardless of their religious beliefs or lack thereof. For facing mortality and maintaining perspective, Stoic practices of contemplating death and impermanence help modern people as much as they helped ancient ones. In a culture that denies death and promises eternal youth, Stoic acceptance of mortality provides a necessary correction. Remembering that everything is temporary, that death could come at any moment, that all external things will eventually be lost, focuses attention on what truly matters and prevents wasting life on trivialities. The genius of Zeno's philosophy lies in its integration of theory and practice, its grounding in realistic assessment of human nature and circumstances, and its focus on what is genuinely possible for humans to achieve. Zeno did not promise to eliminate suffering, solve all problems, or create perfect happiness through external reforms. He offered something more modest, but also more reliable, a method for maintaining inner freedom and dignity regardless of circumstances, for living virtuously when virtue is possible, and for accepting with equanimity what cannot be changed. This modest realism makes Stoicism particularly suitable for difficult times. When optimistic philosophies that promise happiness through external success fail to deliver, when revolutionary movements that promise utopia produce tyranny instead, when self-help approaches that promise easy transformation prove disappointing, Stoicism remains standing. It never promised that life would be easy or that external circumstances would align with our preferences. It only promised that virtue is always possible and always valuable, that tranquility can be achieved through correcting false judgments, and that human dignity need never be surrendered regardless of what fortune brings. Zeno's personal example reinforces his philosophical legacy. He lost everything external and discovered that nothing truly valuable had been lost. He lived simply while teaching profoundly. He maintained perfect integrity while participating in social life. He achieved fame and influence while remaining indifferent to them. He faced death calmly when his time came. His life demonstrated that his philosophy was not mere theory, but a genuinely livable approach to human existence. The story of Stoicism is ultimately the story of human resilience and dignity. It shows that philosophy is not a luxury for comfortable times, but a necessity for difficult ones. It demonstrates that wisdom is not arcane knowledge, accessible only to specialists, but practical insight available to anyone willing to think carefully about what matters. It proves that virtue is not weakness or naivety, but the highest human achievement, making life worth living regardless of external circumstances. For over 2,000 years, whenever people have faced circumstances that threaten to overwhelm them, they have turned to Stoic philosophy and found resources for endurance, guidance for virtue, and consolation in suffering. The shipwreck that destroyed Zeno's old life created a philosophy that has helped countless others survive their own shipwrecks. This is Zeno's lasting gift to humanity, the knowledge that when external things fail, as they inevitably do, we can discover inner resources that nothing external can touch, resources that were there all along, waiting to be recognized and developed. The teachings of Zeno of Citium remain available to anyone seeking them. The path he walked from catastrophe to wisdom, from enslavement to externals to inner freedom, from fear and desire to tranquility, remains open. The Stoic promise that virtue is sufficient for happiness, that reason can guide us to what matters, that we can live with dignity regardless of circumstances, awaits testing by each person who chooses to apply it. 23 centuries after a Phoenician merchant lost his cargo in Mediterranean waters and found philosophy instead, Zeno's wisdom continues to offer light to those navigating their own storms, guidance for those seeking solid ground, and hope for those who fear they have lost everything but have not yet discovered what truly matters.